How's it going, guys? My name is Dom, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to create your very own image editor using JavaScript and HTML5 Canvas. This right here is going to be an awesome project for beginner to intermediate JavaScript developers who want to make something interesting. As you can see here, the user is able to upload an image and then they can begin changing the brightness, saturation, blur, and inversion on that image. And because we're going to be using HTML5 Canvas, they are also able to right click and save that image to their computer. As usual, the source code for this is going to be linked down below if you want to reference it while you watch today's video, and we can now begin on the code. All right, so we can begin within the HTML file right here. We're going to be beginning from scratch to create what I just showed you. Now we can see here I've also linked up a CSS file that is within a directory called CSS, and the file is main.css. I've got the exact same setup for the JavaScript file right down here, and I'm also going to be using the defer attribute on the JavaScript include. This is going to ensure that the script is only going to execute once the document has loaded, and it's going to prevent any potential errors with undefined elements and things like that. So once you've got the linked CSS file and a linked JavaScript file with the defer attribute, we're going to be good to go to begin working on this image editor. As we can see, both the CSS and the JavaScript file are currently empty. So we're going to begin inside the HTML, then work on the CSS, and then lastly work on the JavaScript. Now, when it comes to the HTML for this image editor, we're going to begin by creating a new div right here with a class of editor. So this is going to be the container for the entire image editor. It's going to have two columns. One column is going to be the toolbar on the left side, and on the right side, the larger side, that's going to be, of course, where the image is going to be held. All right. So when it comes to the editor, we can create a new div here called toolbar to represent the toolbar. And then down below, we can make a second div called image area, and we can leave that blank for now and head back inside the toolbar. So when it comes to the toolbar, as we saw in the example, there's going to be essentially a part where the user can select a file. Then we're going to have 4 or more input fields below that. So if we go back in the HTML here, we can now create a new div with a class of toolbar item. And this toolbar item is just a container around an individual sort of row in the sidebar or in the toolbar. So for the first toolbar item, it's going to contain the input field to select a new image. So we can say input with a type of file. We're going to be giving this an ID now of something like image file input, just like that. I'm going to leave it just like that. And we can make a second toolbar item here. This one here is going to be for the brightness control. So we can scroll down and we can create a new label here. The label is going to be for the brightness element. So we're going to be creating the brightness element very shortly. But inside the label, we can also just say brightness, and I'm going to give it a class here of simply just toolbar-input. Okay, well actually toolbar-label. So I might just stop here, save, go back in the browser, and we're going to end up with something like this. We've got the input field and we have the brightness label. Going back in the HTML, we can now create a new input field with a type of range. So we're going to be, let's try it again. Input type range. So the range input field is going to allow you to obviously drag around a slider on a certain range. So that's why we're using the range input field right there. And we're also going to give this an ID of brightness. Now, giving this an ID of brightness is going to allow us to access it inside the JavaScript file, but also it means the label is going to match it. So if you were to click on the label, then it's automatically going to focus the range. All right. Let's also give this here a class of toolbar-input, just like that. Now we can save this, go back in the browser, and we get something like this. As we can see, we've got this range and we can, control it, we can drag it around and so on. Now, when it comes to what value this range outputs, you're allowed to control that using the min and the max attributes on the input field. as an example, I can say a minimum for the brightness is going to be 0 and a maximum of 200, because we're going to see later on that the way it works is by default, an image has a brightness of 100 or 100%. If you were to make this 0%, it's going to be dark, and 200% is going to be double the brightness. So that's going to be the range of the input field. If I go back in the browser now, we're going to see no visual change, but when accessing this value using JavaScript, you're going to get a number between 0 and 200. All right, cool. We can now duplicate this div for the toolbar item a further 3 times for the remainder of the options. So we can say here as an example, saturation, and simply change these IDs to be saturation, just like that, with a lowercase s. The range for saturation is going to work in the exact same way as brightness, so we can leave this at 0 and 200. When it comes to blur, we can once again change these IDs. The blur range is going to go from 0 to actually just 25, because I found that when you set the blur to 100 pixels, we're going to see later on, but that's just too much. So having it as 25 is going to be a nice amount of blur as the maximum. And lastly, down here, we can adjust the inversion, and we can set the IDs once again to inversion. And the range for this one is going to be between 0 and 100, just like the other ones. We're going to see later on how to actually set all of these on the image. So we've got the 4 input fields. If I go back in the browser, we're going to end up with something like this. Okay. The last part of the HTML is going to be down within the image area, and we're going to be using a canvas today. So the reason for using a canvas is because we want to give the user the ability to right click and save the image after it's been edited. So the canvas allows us to do that. Okay. Now we're going to give this an ID of canvas. Okay, then a default height of 500 and a default width of also 500. This right here is optional. It's up to you guys. We're going to be overriding the height and the width using JavaScript anyway, but you can set a default if you would like to. If I go back in the browser now, we're going to end up with the exact same thing visually, and we can now move on to styling this stuff here using CSS to, of course, create this design right here. So going inside the CSS file, we can begin by firstly targeting the body. We're going to remove that default margin of 5 pixels by saying margin at 0. We're going to also set a global font family here of sans serif, and we can minimize this one now and hop down to targeting the editor. So the editor, like I showed earlier, is the main container which contains the 2-column layout for the toolbar and the image area. So we're going to be using a display of flex to give us that 2-column layout. Alongside this, a width of 100 VW and a height of 100 VH is going to give us a full width and height of the viewport or the visible area in the browser. So if I was to give this a background of, let's just do gray, we're going to see what this looks like. If I go back in the browser, the whole area is now covered. And of course, this is just due to the fact that the editor is, of course, 100% on the width and 100% on the height. Now, going back in the CSS, we can now target the toolbar itself. So the toolbar is going to have a set width of 250 pixels, as well as a background here of light gray. I'm also just going to remove the background on the editor. That was just there for an example. Okay. Back in the browser, and we get this right here, that obviously that gray background there. We can hop back inside here now and now target a toolbar item. So for this one, I want to simply give it some padding because I want to have some space around every single one of those items there. So save this and we get some space now. Okay, so looking not too bad so far. We can now begin to target the toolbar label. So when it comes to, tool label. So for these labels, brightness, saturation, etc., we can set firstly a display of block. This right here is going to ensure that if we go back in the browser now, the label, oops, my mistake. What did I do wrong? Tool label. Back in here. Okay, apologies. I need to make this tool label and tool input. Okay, just like that. Cool. So tool label with that display of block is now going to make sure that the input field is going to be on the next line. So you got one line for the brightness or the label, one line for the input field. Okay. Going back in the CSS, we can also set on these labels a margin bottom of 5 pixels to make some space between the input field and the label, as well as a font size here of 14 pixels and a font weight of bold. Save this back in the browser and we get this look right here. Let's now make the input fields themselves 100% width to ensure that they take up the full width. Back in here now, we can set the tool-input with a width of 100%, just like that. Okay, and we get this here, perfect. And lastly, or almost lastly, we can target the image area. So this right here is going to be our second column on the right side. And for this one, we can set a flex grow of 1. This right here is going to make sure that the image area takes up the remaining space within the browser. If I go back inside here now and go and inspect the right side, you can see the editor or the image area takes up that remaining space. Okay, cool. Back inside here now, we can set some padding of 20 pixels just to create some space around the image, and a background here of a medium gray. We're going to be using 555, just like that. Okay, back in the browser, we get this. Now, we can now target the canvas itself. So, like I mentioned briefly earlier, we're going to be using Canvas here. So we're going to be rendering the chosen image into the canvas. Now, this image might be a large resolution. You might have like 4,000 pixels by 6,000 pixels. So we need to somehow restrict the canvas to the browser's viewing area. We can do this by setting a maximum width of 100% and a maximum height of also 100%. So now the canvas can't be larger than the width or the height. If I go back in the browser, the scroll bar on the bottom is now gone because if we inspect the canvas, it's now taking up the most space it can, just like that. Okay, cool. We're done with the CSS. We can now move on to the JavaScript, of course. Probably the reason why you clicked on today's video. So when it comes to the JavaScript of this image editor, the very first step is going to be to get all of the elements which we need from the HTML. So let's make a few constants up here. We can say const file input equal to document.querySelector. Then select the element with an ID of image file input. Of course, this one here is going to refer to our main file input at the top here. We can copy this code down and make one for the canvas, selecting the ID of canvas. And also as a bonus, we're going to be getting a reference to the canvas context, okay, equal to canvas.getContext and then 2D. If you've worked with HTML5 canvases before, you're going to know what this thing is used for. It's used for drawing stuff onto the canvas, all right? And we're going to be getting to that very shortly. We can just copy the query selector line once again, this time for the brightness input. We're going to be selecting with the ID of brightness, and we can copy this a further 3 more times and simply replace all of these here with saturation. Then we can say blur, and lastly we can just say inversion, just like that. Okay, cool. So we have all of the elements selected. We can now define a JavaScript object called settings equal to a new empty object right there. So this settings object is going to store the values for each one of our inputs. So it's going to have properties for brightness, saturation, blur, and inversion. And whatever settings are inside here, we're going to be applying to the image within the canvas. Okay, cool. We're going to also define a variable here called image equal to null by default. So this right here is going to store the currently selected image. by default, when the page first loads up, the user hasn't selected an image yet, so it's going to be null. Okay, cool. We can now pop down here and we can define a new function called reset settings. Okay, this function is going to take the settings object and then reset them back to their default values. So we can say here, settings.brightness is equal to, and we can say 100 inside here. Now I'm using a string version of the number 100 because it's going to come out of the input field as a string. It doesn't really matter because we're going to be using this value to make a string anyway. So don't worry about the fact that it's a string. We can do this 3 more times once again for saturation, blur, and then lastly, of course, the inversion. So for the blur and inversion, they're going to be a default of 0 because if your image has no blur, then it's going to look normal. And if your image has no inversion, then once again, it's going to look normal. So 0 just means it's not applied at all, whereas 100 is the center between 0 and 200. Okay, cool. So we'll reset the settings using this function here. We can also apply these new values or the defaults to the input fields themselves, because every time you choose a new image, we want to reset those settings. Okay, so we'll say here brightness input dot value equal to settings dot brightness, just like that. Once again, the exact same thing for the further 3 properties: saturation, blur, and finally inversion. I apologize for all of the duplication or the copy and pasting here, but of course it's required because we have 4 settings. Okay, when the page first loads up, we're going to run the reset settings function to, of course, give us those defaults. Let's save this, go back in the browser, and we get no difference. Okay, but we do know now that, of course, these values are coming from that object. As an example, if we were to set the brightness to be 150, watch this bar here. Okay, I'll save it, go back, and it's in the middle now. So we definitely know that our values are coming from this function right here. Now, we can define a new function to update these settings because we're going to look at how we can update these settings first. And then once we've updated them, we can apply it to the canvas. So I guess the more interesting part is going to come towards the end of this section where we're actually going to be applying a filter and, of course, applying these properties to the image. So we can say function update setting. It's going to take in a key and a value. So you can call this function to update the brightness as the key, and the value can be, of course, whatever you want it to be. So update setting is going to say settings at the key equal to the value. As an example, if you say brightness here, it'll be settings.brightness equal to whatever the value is. All right. Let's save this, go back in the browser here. Let's go inside the console now, and we're going to be using the live expression tool in Chrome DevTools. So I'll click on this one here, the eye icon. I can now run the function, I can just type in settings. So this right here is going to output the current values inside the settings object, so 100 and so on. As I change this object, it's going to show it instantly at the top here. As an example, if I say update setting and I say I want to update the brightness to be 25, okay, I'll press enter and it goes to 25. So we're going to basically say when the user changes the range here, we're going to call update setting to, of course, update that setting. Okay, cool. Let's go back in the code here. And one last thing for the update setting function is going to be this. Okay, we're going to say if there is no image, then we can't do anything. So let's just return. So that just means, look, if the user has no image selected, then let's not even bother updating the settings. Okay, great. So we're almost there. Well, kind of. Okay, well, we're about halfway there. Now, the next thing to do here is going to be to react to when the user changes the input fields. So we'll hop down here and we're going to grab the brightness input, okay? And we're going to say Add event listener. When the user decides to change the brightness level, then we can run this function, and this function is going to update the setting. We're going to pass in brightness, and then we're going to say brightness input dot value as the value being passed in. I might just zoom out here a little bit so you guys can see it. There we go. So that's pretty self-explanatory. When the input field changes, we're going to update the setting, update the brightness setting to be whatever is inside the input field. Because remember, those ranges are converted to a number by default. Okay, let's hop down here. The exact same thing for the saturation. Okay, then we can do the same thing for the blur. And of course, you guessed it. Oops, that was too far. You guessed it, the exact same thing for the inversion. So we can go bang and inversion. Cool. So now if I go back in the browser, we have this live expression still. If I change the brightness, it's going to be updated there. It is not. Let's try and figure out why. Run this function, update the setting, update the brightness. Okay, of course, there is no image. So we can probably comment out this line for now and just go back in here and just try it out. So we can put that line back in at the end of the JavaScript section. Let's have that live expression again. Okay, let's update the brightness, and it's going to update straight away. This of course works for all of the input fields just like that. Okay, great. Let's refresh the page and then go back in VS Code. So we have the reactions set up. We can now get to the part where the user can of course choose a file. So for this one, if we hop down here, we're going to say file input.addEventListener. When the user chooses a new file using the file input field, it's going to run this function here. Now, in order to get an image and display it on a canvas, we need to essentially take the file and interpret it as an image within an image object, because Canvas can only accept image objects when it comes to, of course, drawing that image. So it's going to make sense very shortly. Okay, we're going to begin here by defining the image variable from earlier on, the one right up here. Okay, we'll say image equal to a new instance of image. So this right here, this is going to be the image object which the canvas is going to accept. And you can think of this image object as simply just being a standard HTML image tag. Okay, cool. Now we're going to say, once we, of course, have made the image, we can say image.addEventListener. We're going to listen for the load event. Okay, so what's going to happen is basically we're going to take the file that the user has selected and then load it into this image object. So that is what this event listener is doing, because it's a asynchronous task and we're going to be able to react to it once it's finished loading. Once the image has been loaded into the image object, we can then simply reset the settings, and very shortly we're going to be defining a new function up here which is going to then render that image to the canvas. So we can just say a new comment and say render image. We're going to be commenting out that line very shortly. Okay, so reset the settings back to default when the image has been loaded up, and also render that new image. Okay, cool. Now, how do we load the image from the file into the image object? Well, we can do so using an object URL. Okay, so we can do this by saying image.source equal to url.create object URL. Then we can say here file input.files at index 0. Now, let me explain this part here first with the files at index 0. Because a file input can accept multiple files, if you choose to use the multiple attribute on the file input, you're going to get an array back. So index 0 just means, let me choose the first file out of the potential infinity. Okay. Now in this case here, because the user can only choose one file, there's always going to be something at index 0. So That's why we're using index 0 to get the only file that comes back. Okay? This create object URL is going to take your file and then convert it into a URL which the browser essentially can use to reference your image. So I'll show you what they look like. If I do console.log and I'll log out what this looks like, so the create object URL, I'll save it, go back in the browser. We can now choose a file here. I'll choose the image01. We get this right here. So within this tab, essentially this URL refers to your image, okay? And you can actually put this inside, image source attributes as an example. Let me show you this right now. Let's copy the URL, okay? Go into the elements section. Let's just add or edit the HTML inside the toolbar here, okay? And we can just add something underneath the last toolbar item. We'll say a new image tag, just like this, image source equal to, and I can use that URL as the image source. I'll press enter, control enter, sorry, and we get that image right there. So that URL is simply just a reference to the image, okay? Let's refresh the page, go back inside VS Code. Now we know what image.source is doing. It's simply setting that URL. Once the image has been loaded from that URL, we're going to reset the settings. Let's try this out. Go back in the browser. I'll make brightness 100, everything 100, right? Choose the image, open, and it goes back to the defaults. So we have the defaults set up. We can now render the image. So for this one, back up here, we're going to say function render image. Like I said, we're going to be taking this image and rendering it to the canvas. First thing to do is going to grab the canvas, and we can set the canvas width to be the image width. So image.width. The exact same thing for the height, just like that. Oops. Let's go back inside here. So the exact same thing for the height. Set the height of the canvas. Okay. Then we can say canvas context. Okay. This is where it gets interesting. We're going to say .filter equal to, and we're going to keep it an empty string for now. We're going to be changing this to be a representation of all of the settings from above here. But for now, let's keep it empty and just make the image work. Okay, we'll say canvas context dot draw image, and we'll draw the image here, passing in the image itself, the image object, 0 and 0 for the position of where it's going to be. It's going to be in the top left corner. Because the canvas width and height is set to the image width and height, it'll just simply take up the entire space of the canvas itself. Let's save this. We've also put this line of code in right down here to render the image. Okay. We'll save this, go back in the browser. We can choose a file just like this, press open, and it appears right here. Okay. Now, it might be a good time to put back that commented out code for the update setting. This way we don't run into errors when we, of course, have no image on the screen. Okay. So we've got the render image. We can now work on this filter. So we're going to be using, this filter property works in a very similar fashion to the CSS filter property in that you can specify multiple filters here. So if we go to the MDN documentation on this, we'll say canvas filter MDN. You have this property right here, which of course is the one that I'm mentioning. And you can see here, you're able to specify multiple different filters at once using a string and then putting a space between each filter. There's also an explanation of the different available filters like brightness, contrast, drop shadow, and so on. Of course, we care about invert, saturate. We also care about the contrast and brightness. Okay. So let's go back in VS Code here and let's write a function. This function is going to be called generate filter. This function is going to return the filter string that I just showed you on MDN. Okay. So we can first make a few new constants. Okay. We can say brightness, saturation, blur, and then inversion equal to setting. So This right here is using object destructuring. We're simply taking the property from the settings object and putting it inside a constant so we can use it down below. This is just going to make the code a little bit, it's going to make the line of code shorter, okay? Because we're going to see very shortly, it's going to get quite large, okay? So we'll return here using template strings, the backticks near the one on your keyboard, and we can start with the brightness property. So brightness in brackets and a %. We're going to say $ curly braces, brightness. Grab the brightness value and inject it inside here, giving us something like 100% or 75% or 124%, whatever it might be. Okay, so get the brightness and put it inside there. Space, then we can say saturate. Once again, using a %, we can do $ and then say saturation. Space, blur. Okay, this one here is going to be a pixel amount, so we can say px here. $ curly braces, blur, and then lastly we have the invert filter. It's going to take in a %, then use $, and we can say inversion here. Now we're going to simply call generate filter inside here. I'll save this, go back in the browser, choose a file, choose an image, change the brightness, and nothing happens. The reason for that is because we're not calling the render image function when a value changes. So the settings changes, but of course the canvas isn't rendered. So let's go back inside here. When we update a setting after it's been done, we're going to call render image to simply re-render the image with a new filter, which comes from, of course, our generate filter function. Back in the browser and we are done. Let's choose a new image here. We can say this one here, this time up the brightness and it updates, saturation lower, increase the blur, inversion, and so on. So that right there is your image editor using JavaScript, and of course you can right click to save image or even copy because we're using Canvas. If you were using a standard HTML image tag with the filter CSS property, you wouldn't be able to save the actual changes you made to the image, just the original image itself. And that is all for today's video, guys. Hope you enjoyed this one and you learned something. If you did, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.